The millionaire's son was traumatized for 9 months. What the nanny did that day changed everything. On the outskirts of New York, autumn had turned the maple trees along the winding driveway into rivers of gold. At the end of the road stood the Hale estate, a $25 million fortress of glass and steel. From the outside, it gleamed with the cold brilliance of wealth and power. Yet inside, every wall carried the suffocating silence that had lingered for 9 long months, since the night the fire devoured part of the mansion. In a room on the second floor, a 5-year-old boy sat motionless before the wide window. Ethan Hale looked like a small statue, his empty gaze locked on the eastern garden, the very place where the blaze had once raged. The lawns had been restored, the charred ruins erased by careful landscaping. But in Ethan's eyes, the flames still burned. He had not spoken a single word since that night. He remained silent, as if his voice had died along with the fire that took his mother. Across the mansion, Richard Hale, Ethan's father, drifted through long hallways lined with abstract paintings and minimalist sculptures. At 42, the founder of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire had aged a decade in mere months. Silver streaked his hair, shadows etched permanent lines beneath his eyes. His success continued in the world outside. Skyscrapers in Manhattan bore his company's logo. Stock prices soared. But here, inside this house, victory meant nothing. All he had left was the crushing silence of his son and the empty space left by Emily, the wife lost to the flames. Every morning Richard followed the same ritual, stepping into the surveillance room, turning on the wall of monitors, and watching his son's every movement, or rather, his stillness. He did not dare disturb the boy, only guarded him from afar, as if looking away even for a second might mean losing something else. 9 months had passed like this, 9 months of futile attempts and sleepless nights. The mansion, once a symbol of triumph, had become a mausoleum of memories. The sound of children's laughter had long been extinguished, replaced by the echo of grief. Richard knew that without a miracle, Ethan would remain trapped in the night of the fire forever. What he could not yet know was that the miracle he had been waiting for was about to walk through the gates of the Hale estate. For 9 long months, Richard Hale had tried everything to pull his son out of the suffocating silence. He had hired the best psychiatrists in America, trauma specialists from Europe, therapists who used play therapy, even cutting-edge virtual reality programs developed by his own company. Yet the result was always the same. Ethan remained mute, his gaze fixed on the window as if the outside world no longer existed. Once, a renowned doctor from Boston arrived, confident he could make the boy speak within weeks. But after 4 sessions, he quietly packed his bags, admitting defeat. Another specialist attempted child hypnosis, but Ethan sat like stone, unmoved by any suggestion. The last nanny didn't last more than 2 days, overwhelmed by the heavy atmosphere that haunted every corner of the house. The mansion had become a crystal cage, trapping Richard and his son together with memories of fire. Every hallway reminded him of Emily, the woman who had once turned this place into a home. Now each room whispered only absence and regret. Richard lived with the tormenting question, what if I hadn't been in Dubai that night? What if I had been here? Would Emily still be alive? The guilt gnawed at him each sleepless night until his body felt like a hollow shell. By day, Richard continued to run Hale Dynamics, his global tech empire. He appeared in virtual meetings, spoke to the press, signed billion-dollar contracts. To the outside world, he was still a symbol of brilliance, a visionary who could shift markets with a single announcement. But once the meetings ended, he returned to the surveillance room, eyes glued to the monitors, watching his son's motionless figure. On many nights, Richard stepped quietly into Ethan's room, hoping to break through the boy's trance. He tried speaking softly, telling stories about Emily, even reading aloud the fairy tales Ethan once adored. But the child gave no response. His empty eyes stared through Richard as though his father were nothing more than a shadow in the room. Fear began to consume him. Fear that Ethan would never come back. Fear that he himself was dissolving into the same silence. Each morning, seeing his son frozen like a statue, Richard felt as if his own life were being carved into stone as well. Deep inside, he knew the truth. Unless something utterly different, something miraculous, happened, he would lose Ethan forever. Even if the boy's body remained in the house, his soul was drifting further and further away. On the first Monday of October, the chime of the electronic gate rang out. Richard nearly ignored it. His eyes were still fixed on the surveillance screen, where Ethan sat motionless before the window, as always. But then the butler's voice came through the intercom. The new nanny had arrived. Richard drew a long breath, as though he were gambling with the last fragments of hope. 11 people had come and gone in the past 9 months. Some quit, some were frightened off, none could withstand the oppressive atmosphere of the house. And now, at the towering steel gate, Sophie Carter stood with a modest suitcase and a calm gaze. She looked younger than 28, brown hair tied neatly back, a plain dress, and in her resume, Sophie listed experience working for prominent families in Boston. A bachelor's degree in psychology was mentioned briefly, but never emphasized. Richard recalled the phone interview. Her voice was low, reserved, offering no promises of miracles. Perhaps it was precisely that humility that made him hire her. When she entered Richard's office, Sophie did not appear impressed by the wall of glass, the awards, or the photographs of Richard shaking hands with world leaders. Instead, her eyes lingered on a single silver-frame photo on the corner of the desk. Richard, Emily, and Ethan on the Montauk Beach, taken the summer before the fire. Richard recounted the story with a steady tone, like a report repeated too many times. The fire had started with an electrical short in Emily's studio. He had been in Dubai. Ethan was pulled out by the nanny, while Emily was trapped. A young firefighter, Daniel Carter, had died when the ceiling collapsed. From that night on, Ethan had not spoken a word. Richard stopped there, his hand gripping the desk, though his voice remained clinically detached. Sophie listened in silence. She asked no questions, offered no solutions. When Richard finished, she merely nodded and said softly, "Please let me see the boy." Together they climbed the second floor, through hallways lined with abstract paintings no one noticed anymore. At the door to Ethan's room, Richard lowered his voice with the same weary warning he had given to so many before. Don't expect too much. Don't be disappointed if he doesn't respond. But Sophie gave no reply. She simply opened the door, stepping into the vast bedroom where Ethan sat, as still as stone before the window. Expensive toys gathered dust on the shelves. On the Persian rug, Sophie set down the large fabric bag she had brought. Without a greeting, without the sing-song tone of forced affection adults often use with children, she sat on the floor, opened the bag, and spilled thousands of Lego pieces in a cascade of color. The clattering sound broke the suffocating silence of the room. Sophie bent over and began to build, slowly, methodically, as if she were entirely alone in another world, unconcerned with whether anyone was watching. On the security monitor, Richard frowned. He had seen many approaches before, but never anyone begin this way. Just another one who will give up, he thought. And yet, somewhere deep within, a faint instinct stirred, a whisper that perhaps this time might be different. At first, the room was drenched in silence. Ethan sat frozen, his gaze locked on the window, as if Sophie's presence did not exist. But Sophie showed no impatience. She carefully chose Lego bricks, piecing them together, then dismantling them, as though she had slipped into a world entirely her own. Half an hour passed, and Richard nearly stepped in. From the surveillance room he watched, convinced this would be yet another futile attempt. Just as he was about to intervene, Sophie began to whisper, not to Ethan, but to the spaceship she was building. She spoke of a distant planet where children could soar through the skies. There, every tear that fell would turn into a shooting star, carrying the wishes of its owner. She told of a special moon where mothers who had to leave their children behind waited, baking cakes of light and sending stories through beams of moonlight. Her voice was low, steady, not falsely sweet, but gentle, like a lullaby. An hour slipped by, then two. Richard canceled important meetings just to remain glued to the screens. And then something unexpected stirred. Ethan shifted slightly. Not much, just enough for him to glimpse Sophie out of the corner of his eye. His small hand twitched, the first sign of awareness in 9 endless months. Sophie did not break rhythm. She continued her story about young astronauts, including one boy who had lost his voice in a cosmic storm, yet found ways to communicate through colors and the structures he built. Ethan's eyes followed every new Lego brick she added to the ship. For the first time in months, a flicker of light shimmered in his gaze. Fragile, yet undeniable. By the 3rd hour, Sophie lifted the nearly completed spaceship and said the voyage required a brave pilot, someone who knew pain but was still willing to fly toward new stars. And then the miracle happened. A tiny hoarse voice, rusty from 9 months of silence, broke the air. "Can I come too?" Richard froze at the monitor. He collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs he had locked away for almost a year. In the room, Sophie remained composed. She looked up, smiled gently, and replied in a steady voice, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Of course you can, but first, we need to build you a special spacesuit, because this journey will pass through galaxies no one has ever explored." Slowly, Ethan rose from his chair. His legs trembled as though relearning how to move. Step by step, he made his way toward Sophie and sat down, not right beside her, but close enough to see the spaceship clearly. Sophie handed him a few small bricks, showing him where to place them. Ethan fitted them carefully, and together they continued building. That day, Ethan spoke only a few more words. Here, this one. But for Richard, it was nothing short of a miracle. From that day forward, in the room once filled only with silence and shadows, small rays of light began to break through. Ethan did not suddenly return to the lively boy he had once been, but every tiny detail revealed change. In the mornings, he no longer sat frozen for hours like a statue. Instead, he often watched Sophie assemble Lego pieces. Sometimes he picked up a brick and placed it where she pointed. Words were still scarce, but his eyes no longer looked lifeless. Richard watched everything through the cameras, his chest tightening each time Ethan tilted his head slightly or showed the faintest smile at Sophie's stories of new planets. He was grateful, yet unsettled. Why was this young woman able to do what countless renowned doctors and therapists had failed to achieve? During the day, Sophie patiently played with Ethan. She never forced him to speak more, nor demanded that he look her in the eye. She simply continued to build worlds out of plastic bricks, weaving adventures among the stars. Slowly, Ethan became part of those worlds. One afternoon, he handed Sophie a piece and whispered, "This blue." For Richard, that brief sentence was more valuable than any medical report he had ever received. At mealtime, Sophie did not insist Ethan go down to the grand dining hall. Instead, she sat on the rug with him, eating while they built. This simple adjustment allowed Ethan to eat more, bite by bite, slowly but steadily. Richard watched through the monitor, his heart swelling. The boy who had refused food for months was finally eating an entire meal without being coaxed. At night, when Ethan grew weary, Sophie sat in the chair beside the window, the very spot where he once drifted into sleep. She held a comic book and read aloud, or sometimes hummed a soft tune. When Ethan stirred from nightmares, Sophie did not wake him. She simply placed a gentle hand on his back, patting softly until he calmed again. Richard began to realize Sophie's presence was not only saving his son, but also reaching him. On the days he stayed home, he overheard small bursts of laughter drifting from Ethan's room. The sound felt foreign, as though he had forgotten what it once was. One evening, standing outside the door, he listened to Ethan giggle as Sophie mimicked the voice of an astronaut, and Richard nearly broke down in tears. It had been so long since the house felt alive, yet at the same time, a new fear stirred within him. Who was Sophie, truly? She had accomplished what no one else could. Her calmness, the way she spoke to Ethan as though she understood his pain to the core, all of it made Richard feel both grateful and uneasy. Deep down, he knew that one day he would have to uncover the secret behind this young woman. 2 months had passed since the day Ethan spoke his first words. The atmosphere in the Hale mansion had begun to shift. Children's footsteps once again echoed through the hallways, and colorful Lego bricks scattered across the bedroom floor. Richard spent more time at home, pretending to work remotely, but in truth wanting to be closer to his son. And what surprised him most was the growing presence of Sophie. One November evening, after Ethan had drifted into sleep, Richard went down to the living room and found Sophie tidying away the last Lego pieces of the day. The room was quiet, save for the wind whistling against the glass. Richard lowered himself into the armchair opposite her, breaking the invisible barrier that had always separated them. His voice was rough when he spoke. "I've never told anyone the details of that night. Maybe I need to." And then, as though a door had finally opened after months of restraint, Richard let it all out. The business trip in Dubai he couldn't avoid, the last phone call with Emily, a trivial argument that had become an unhealed scar. He spoke of the moment he received the news, the frantic flight home, the horror of seeing the house consumed in smoke and ashes. And then he mentioned the young firefighter who had died, Daniel Carter, who had thrown himself into the flames trying to save Emily. The moment that name left Richard's lips, Sophie froze. Her hands, busy folding the Lego box, halted mid-motion. A single tear slid down her cheek, though her face remained composed. Richard stared into her blue-green eyes, and suddenly the truth blazed before him. "Carter," he whispered. "What is your connection to Daniel Carter?" Sophie could no longer hide. The walls she had built for months collapsed all at once. With trembling hands, she pulled a creased photograph from her coat pocket. A young man in a firefighter's uniform, smiling brightly into the camera. "He was my brother," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "Daniel died in that fire trying to save your wife. I had to know if his sacrifice meant something. I used a false name to get in. At first I thought I'd only look at Ethan once and then leave, but I couldn't. I saw a ghost of a boy. I knew if I walked away, I'd be betraying my brother." Richard sat stunned, his breath caught in his chest. Suddenly, every moment replayed with piercing clarity. Her uncanny calm, the way her voice never faltered when Ethan stayed silent, the patience that outlasted every expert before her. It wasn't training, it was grief. She knew loss because she carried it in her own heart, and that loss had carved a bridge straight to his son. And he did not feel the fury he might have expected. Instead, an overwhelming relief washed over him. For the first time in months, he looked directly into Sophie's eyes and saw the same grief he bore, the grief that had made them, unknowingly, allies. They sat in silence for a long while. And then, in that quiet, Richard's tears fell. Sophie cried too, no longer hiding. At that very moment, a small voice broke the stillness from the doorway. "Dad! Sophie!" Ethan stood there in his pajamas, eyes wet, clutching a stuffed bear. He stepped forward, squeezing between them, placing his tiny hands on theirs. No more words were needed. His presence alone was enough to bind two broken sorrows into a single embrace. For the first time in months, Richard felt less alone in his grief. Sophie's truth had shaken him, but also bound them closer, as though Daniel's sacrifice had tied their fates together. Yet, just as that fragile bond began to take root, another storm gathered on the horizon, one even more merciless than fire or silence. It did not come from Ethan's trauma, but from Emily's own family, the Whitmores, who had never once accepted Richard. The Whitmores were a dynasty in Boston, wealthy, powerful, their name etched into generations of industry. To them, Richard Hale was an outsider, a tech upstart who had risen too fast, too far. When Emily chose him, they called it a mistake. And now, upon learning that a stranger, a woman carrying the Carter name, forever tied to the night of the blaze, was living in the house with their grandson, they decided to strike. One cold morning, Richard opened a thick envelope from the courthouse, a custody petition. The words cut like a blade. The father is incapable of providing a stable environment. The child has been exposed to an individual with a suspicious identity. Richard sat frozen in his office, the morning light pooling pale across his face. His hands shook so violently that the paper slipped to the floor. When Sophie entered and saw him, she knew before he spoke. "It's my fault," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "I should never have come here. If I leave now, maybe—" "No." Richard's reply was sharp as steel, yet his eyes burned with desperation. "If you leave, Ethan loses everything again. I'd rather lose in court than let him lose you." The days that followed turned the mansion into a silent battlefield. Richard poured himself into legal preparation, while Sophie devoted herself to Ethan, hiding the dread that gnawed at her heart. Ethan sensed the tension. He clung to Sophie's hand constantly, refusing to let go. The first hearing arrived. The New York State Courthouse overflowed. Across the aisle, the Whitmores swept in with an army of elite lawyers, their confidence radiating like armor. They painted Richard before the judge as a man consumed by obsession, keeping his son locked in a mausoleum of grief. Sophie they flayed without mercy. An imposter, a woman who infiltrated under false pretenses, a dangerous influence. Richard sat rigid, his back unbent, yet each word slashed him open. He glanced at Ethan, his boy trembling, clutching Sophie's hand with desperate strength. In that moment, Richard understood. This was not just a legal battle. It was a fight for the fragile family they had only just begun to rebuild. And then came the twist no one expected. When the court ordered a deeper inquiry into the fire, technical records from the maintenance company emerged. They revealed the mansion's fire suppression system had been deliberately disabled before the night of the blaze, at the direct request of Whitmore Industries. The courtroom froze. Projected on the screen were leaked emails, explicit instructions to delay maintenance in order to cut costs. Each line was a silent indictment. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Sophie wrapped Ethan tightly in her arms. Richard's eyes never left the Whitmores. The very people who had condemned him now sat pale and rigid, confronted by the truth. It was their negligence, their greed, that had killed their own daughter. There were no more arguments. The Whitmores' lawyers fell silent. The judge's gavel struck, dismissing the petition outright. The once mighty family left the courtroom hunched, their dignity shattered before the public eye. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but the Whitmores kept their gaze fixed on the ground. As Richard walked out that day, he felt as though a stone armor he had carried for 9 long months cracked and fell away. He was not the guilty one. Neither was Sophie. They were survivors, bound together by loss caused by others' greed. And as Ethan clasped both their hands, the three of them stepped into the chaos of reporters and questions. But inside, there was only quiet relief. For the first time, Richard believed it fully. They were not just father, son, and a stranger. They were, in truth, a family. After the trial, the Hale mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum of memories. The glass walls still gleamed under the winter sun, but inside, the air had changed. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed through the halls again. His occasional laughter drifted from his bedroom, and within Richard's chest, something that felt like new life began to stir. He no longer lay awake at night, tortured by what-ifs. Now, whenever he looked at Ethan, he thought of tomorrow. Sophie, too, no longer felt like an intruder living on borrowed grief. She felt clearly that Ethan saw her as part of the safe world he was rebuilding. And Richard, the man who had once sealed himself inside the armor of success, began to open his heart again. One winter evening, as snow fell thick outside, Richard invited Sophie to dinner in the living room. No butlers, no formality, just a single candle on the walnut table and 2 glasses of red wine. Ethan was asleep upstairs. For the first time since Emily's death, Richard sat before a woman with gentle eyes, not the gaze of a CEO, but of a man. He raised his glass, his voice low. "I once thought I'd never open my heart again. But then, you came. You didn't just bring Ethan back. You pulled me back from the dark, too." Sophie lowered her gaze, her hands clutching the edge of her dress. She didn't reply right away, only smiled faintly in the flickering candlelight. Slowly, Richard rose and stepped closer to her. From his jacket pocket, he drew out a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a simple ring, the diamond modest but shining with pure light. "There is nothing I can say that would be enough to express my gratitude to you. But I know this. I don't want to walk alone anymore. Sophie Carter, will you stand with me to raise Ethan, to carry both the shadows and the light of this life as a true family?" His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. In that moment, Sophie broke into tears. They were not tears of grief, but of release. She nodded over and over, covering her mouth with her hand. Richard knelt before her, sliding the ring onto her slender finger. Just then, a soft sound came from the staircase. Ethan, hair tousled, wearing pajamas, stood there, his wide eyes fixed on them. Richard froze, but Ethan walked down slowly, stopping before them. In a calm, almost solemn voice, he said, "Dad, Sophie, if you're asking her to marry you, then I want to ask too. I want Sophie to be my second mom." The words undid them both. Sophie knelt to his level, wrapping him in her arms. Richard bent down, enclosing them both. In that instant, the proposal was no longer just a vow between a man and a woman. It became a sacred covenant among 3 wounded souls, promising to rebuild a home from ashes. The following spring, they held a small ceremony in the Eastern Garden, the very wing once consumed by flames, now reborn as a field of white roses. No grand spectacle, no strangers, just a few loved ones and a piano playing softly in the breeze. Ethan walked the lawn with a little box of rings in hand, his face more solemn than any adult's. When Richard and Sophie exchanged their vows, he stood between them, clutching their hands tightly. 2 years later, the cry of newborns filled the mansion once again. Sophie gave birth to twins, a boy named Daniel Jr. in honor of the brother who gave his life, and a girl named Emily Rose to carry the memory of Ethan's first mother. As Richard cradled the 2 tiny miracles and Ethan gazed lovingly at his baby siblings, he knew the miracle had finally taken shape. From fire and tears, a new family had been born. Richard was no longer the man who had once sealed himself in silence and steel. One winter night, standing with Sophie in the Eastern Garden, the ground that once burned, he whispered the idea that would reshape their grief into purpose. Now it was only a patch of green lawn with 2 memorial plaques, one for Emily, one for Daniel. Richard squeezed Sophie's hand and said, "We have to turn this place into something greater, for Ethan and for all the other children." Thus, the Daniel Carter Foundation was born, created to support families of firefighters who had died in the line of duty. Within a year, the foundation had raised millions of dollars, providing scholarships to the children of fallen heroes. Daniel's name became a symbol of courage and priceless sacrifice. But that was only the beginning. On the very ground where the Eastern Wing had burned, Richard and Sophie built the Emily and Daniel Center for Traumatized Children. Ethan, at just 7 years old, cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. In a short yet powerful speech, he said, "Mom Emily and Uncle Daniel are gone, but they left us a place to find our voices again." The center quickly became a home for dozens of children scarred by loss, accidents, or fire. There, children painted, built with Lego, and told stories of imagined worlds, just as Ethan once had at the start of his healing journey. Sophie personally led the art workshops, her hands often smeared with paint. Richard, instead of wearing his usual business suits, now appeared in simple sweaters, working alongside staff to create new programs. Ethan, once a silent ghost, had become a source of inspiration. He read books to the younger kids, showed them how to build Lego spaceships. The light that Sophie had once kindled in him now spread to others. Richard often stood at a distance, watching his son, feeling prouder than of any billion-dollar deal he had ever signed. On the 5th anniversary of the center, the family posed for a photo in front of the new glass building. Richard was no longer armored in his corporate attire, Sophie's hands bore paint stains, and Ethan stood between his younger twin siblings, reading stories to children listening with wide eyes. And in that moment, Richard understood that their greatest legacy was not their vast fortune, but the proof that from grief can rise light, and from ashes can rise new homes. 5 years after that fateful night, the Hale estate was no longer a place of darkness and silence. The once empty halls now echoed with the laughter of children. In the living room, instead of cold surveillance monitors, colorful paintings created by Sophie and the children at the center adorned the walls. In the bedrooms, Lego bricks still scattered across the floor, but now they were symbols of connection, no longer desperate attempts to call a boy back from silence. Ethan, now 10, often sat between his younger twin siblings, reading aloud stories he had written himself. Pages filled with drawings of spaceships, sweet planets, and characters who found their lost voices. In each tale, one could glimpse the reflection of the journey he had once walked. Richard had changed more than anyone. He was no longer the man who buried himself in work to escape grief. Now he could spend hours in the garden, watching Sophie teach art to the children, listening to the laughter of his 3 kids. He understood that true success was not found in skyscrapers bearing the name Hale Dynamics, but in the rebirth of this family. As for Sophie, the woman who once entered the mansion under a false name had become its beating heart. Every time she embraced Ethan or held Daniel Jr. and Emily Rose, she felt she was also holding the memory of her brother. Daniel was gone, but through her actions, through the center bearing his name, and through the very existence of this family, his sacrifice had become immortal. One autumn afternoon, after finishing an art class at the center, Ethan took a marker and wrote across the glass wall, "Families are not always the ones we are born into. Sometimes they are the ones fate sends us when we need them most. And the families forged in fire are the strongest of all." The words were simple, but they left Richard and Sophie standing silently for a long time. They knew it was more than the voice of a child. It was the distilled truth of a journey from loss to rebirth. That night, the family sat in the garden under a sky full of stars. Ethan pointed upward and whispered, "I think Mom Emily and Uncle Daniel are up there, watching us." Richard wrapped his arms around the 3 children while Sophie leaned against his shoulder. No one replied because they all knew Ethan was right. And so, in the place that had once burned to ashes, life now echoed, the shouts of children playing, the music of a piano, the soft clatter of Lego bricks on the floor. A living testament that love can be reborn from grief, and that sometimes the people fate sends in our darkest hours are the very ones who lead us back to the light.